Welcome everyone to the 22nd meeting of the OECD Spatial Productivity Lab. My name is Michela Megnaggi and I'm an economist at the OECD Local Employment and Economic Development Program. The topic of today is green transition and its impact on local labor market. And we have a very interesting program ahead. We will start today with a short introduction from the OECD, which will be followed by 3 presentations. The first one from Nesta in the UK on measuring green jobs and skills in the UK. The second one from the OECD about the role of skills and geography in job changes for the green transition. And the third one on skills-based labor matching tools in the real world. The presentations will be followed by a Q&A session. So as mentioned earlier, the Q&A function is open to you. We would like you to indicate your name and organization and ask your question in the Q&A tab. I don't want to take more time on that. I know that this is a very interesting topic, and I will ask Lucas Klein-Ruschkampf to give an introduction to the topic on green skills and impact on local labor market. Lucas is an economist and is the coordinator of local labor market analysis unit here at OECD. Lucas, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Michela, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much to all our panelists joining us today. I'd just like to give a very brief introduction of why this work and why now and why it actually matters. I think our work on the green transition as well as job transitions, thinking about job transitions, are fundamentally motivated by 2 issues. The first one is that in our work with national ministries, regional policy makers, we see that across the OECD, all of them are facing multiple simultaneous transitions and challenges at the same time. For instance, considerable labor shortages, demographic change, which with an aging and shrinking workforce in many places, which could exacerbate labor shortages and so on. Huge leaps in artificial intelligence and digitalization that might create new jobs, lead to automation, so displacement of some jobs, or changes the tasks or the job content of many roles. And of course, the transformation of jobs and industries on the path to net zero, which is the focal point of our discussion today. And all of these transitions and challenges have effects on both labor and skills demand. And at the same time, they're highly place-based, have an uneven impact, concentrated on specific communities, specific group of workers, and so on. And all of this, this multitude or the complexity of these challenges coinciding really warrants increased attention to job transitions and how policymakers can produce new labor market intelligence on job transitions and shape the right policies to facilitate job transitions. Now, why do policies actually matter if they can support job transitions? I mean, first of all, they can help make labor markets more inclusive by, for instance, targeting vulnerable groups such as economically inactive people, young people not in employment, education, or training, or people that have just been laid off. But they are also an essential, perhaps powerful, to address the striking, pervasive labor shortages that we see and to foster, therefore, economic growth. And finally, especially in light of the green transition and labor shortages being a major bottleneck of reaching climate objectives, they can help seize new opportunities and enable the green transition in the first place. And I just want to say, supporting job transitions is also of high significance because the cost of inaction and the cost of job displacements can be significant for the affected workers and the communities. Unemployment can turn into long-term unemployment. It can lead to skills attrition, to the skills and competencies of workers becoming less relevant as time passes, or it can lead to long-lasting reductions in earnings among affected workers and communities. I just want to give you one example to really provide an illustration of the magnitude of some of these costs. Recent work published in the Journal of Public Economics finds, for instance, that workers displaced during the collapse of coal mining in the UK experienced a significant fall in hourly wages of 40% in the year after employment, 80 to 90% in earnings And even after 15 years, after losing their job, the earnings remain depressed 20 to 30% below what they earned previously. You know, and all of this is really accumulating over time, and it's only constituting the effects on individual workers. Additionally, their communities experience a fall in spending, economic activity, and so on. Now, with the green transition, we face the challenge of labor shortages, but also the potential decline of currently carbon emission intensive sectors. So we face also perhaps a risk of these adjustment costs. And namely, for all of those reasons, our work here that will be presented today by my colleague Bessel aims to produce insights on how a focus on workers' skills, sort of adopting a skills-first approach and taking into account the specificities of different communities and places can help facilitate job switches to new jobs or other sectors. So very much looking forward to the discussion and to the presentation of the three panelists today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucas, for this great introduction. I think you really set the scene for today's discussion. I would like to give the floor to Zain and Liz from Nesta. Nesta is the UK Innovation Agency for Social Good, and they're going to present today their work on the skills taxonomy and the Open Jobs Observatory on Green Skills that Nesta has recently developed. I will leave the floor to Liz, who's going to start the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Yeah, I think the next slide. I'm not sure who's in charge of changing the slides. Oh, thanks. Yeah, so I'm going to present about our work at Nesta on measuring green jobs and skills, and pass over to Zain as well during this presentation. So next slide. So just an agenda of the things we'll speak about. I'll give a bit of an introduction to who Nesta are and what the Open Jobs Observatory is, and then talk about how we extracted skills from job adverts in general, and then how we measured greenness in job adverts. And then during that, I'll pass over to Zain to discuss some of our findings of that green jobs work. So next slide, please. So who are Nesta? So some of you may have heard of us, some of you may have not. We're a UK-based charity who design, test and scale new solutions to society's biggest problems. And we're a mission-focused organisation, and we have 3 missions. So first we have A Fairer Start, which is about narrowing the outcome gap between children growing up in disadvantage and the national average. We have A Healthy Life, which is about increasing the average number of healthy years lived in the UK. And we have A Sustainable Future, which is about accelerating the UK's transition to a low-carbon, productive economy by cutting UK household emissions and reducing skills mismatches in the labour market. And over the years at Nesta, we've worked on a few different projects to do with the labour market in general. And over the last year or so, we've been trying to pivot these projects to be kind of mission aligned with these 3 missions. So we've done a bit of work on looking at the careers of people working with early years education, like nursery nurses and jobs like that. And within the Sustainable Future mission, we're, as you can expect, we're looking at green jobs specifically. So the next slide, please. So yeah, one of the kind of core elements of our labour market work has been the Open Jobs Observatory. And this is essentially a database of online job adverts that we've been collecting since the beginning of 2021. And we collect them on a daily basis. And on top of just scraping these job adverts from the internet, we also build these algorithms to extract information from them. So we extract locations, industries, skills, and so yeah, over the years it's been funded by a few different organisations, such as the UK's Department of Education, the Office for National Statistics, and the UKRI, which is the Research and Innovation research body. Next slide, please. And then some stats on the data that we're we're dealing with. So it's online job adverts. The highest density, of course, is in the London region. Next slide, please. And then next slide as well. So I'm just going to talk a bit about extracting skills from job adverts, and then because it kind of lines up with the green skills work. So this work was done a few years ago, where we felt that there was a problem on getting data sets of skills, because they're often paywalled, as you might expect, but they're extremely important, as I'm sure we'll continue to talk about in today's session, to understand regional skills specialities, the skills required for a given occupation, and to help plan for skill shortages. So what we really wanted to do, and because we have a large data science team at Nesta, we wanted to create these open source algorithms to extract skills from job adverts and create various analysis tools for others to explore skills in our data set of job adverts. And next slide. So I won't go into any depth, but this is how it works. You take a job advert, it will tell you where the skills being asked for are, as well as the experiences, and it will map them to a standardized taxonomy, and we use the European Commission's ESCO skills taxonomy. And that allows us to standardize how we report on for example, the most common skills. And then next slide. So as I said, we then did quite a lot of analysis, and we kind of opened these up as an online tool for other people to explore. So one thing you can do is look at the most common skills being asked for in the UK. Communication comes out top. We also built this regional focus of skill intensities across different regions of the UK. So, for example, in London, they have a lot of software skills as well as finance skills in comparison to the rest of the UK. And finally, we could have this focus on occupation. So you could select an occupation like a receptionist, and it would give you the most similar occupations to it based on the skills being asked for. So next slide. So onto green jobs. So building on that work of extracting skills and analysing it, we pushed on to this next project, which was about looking at green skills and jobs. And how we felt was that there was a lack of good bottom-up data on green jobs, and that means that we have a more narrow conversation about the workforce transition to net zero, which might focus on a small number of green jobs, which perhaps are like typical, for example, like a solar panel installer. And we felt there's much more nuance to how green different jobs might be, and also that it's not a binary of green and not green. So we wanted to address this by measuring greenness based on multiple dimensions. So we set about building algorithms for that. So next slide. So essentially, this kind of looks similar to that previous diagram. We extracted parts of a job advert and mapped them to various standardized information. So we could get the occupation, the job title being advertised for, and find which standardized occupation category it is, and then link to some data sets that we had available on the amount of time spent on green tasks. We could also extract parts of the job advert that were to do with the sector advertising. So in this situation, it's the architecture sector, and then map that to industry emissions for the architecture industry. And then using that skills algorithm that I've just explained, we were also able to extract green skills, which allows us to understand what proportion of skills being asked for are green or not. So next slide. So with those algorithms, we applied them to 4 million of our job adverts, and we extracted all this information from them. And that just allows us to create all sorts of insights, as you can imagine, on the greenness of different occupations. And I'll pass over to Zain now to talk about some of those insights.
We can maybe stay on the slide for a moment. And I'll just explain the green measures that we've come up with. And I think that will set up the next part of the presentation quite well. So just to go through the green measures that we've developed. So we've got three quite basic metrics, really. So the first being the proportion of skills being asked for in a job advert that are green. The second being the average time spent on green tasks for a given occupation. And the third relating to the greenhouse gas emissions per unit of economic output for the industry that the job advert is in. So that gives us three metrics for greenness for every occupation that we look at. And we can now look at kind of the findings and insights that allows us to generate. So if you skip forward a couple of slides, I'll just walk us through some of our key findings. So the first finding that we want to emphasize is that there's really no such thing as a job that is green or not green. So as we mentioned before, we set out to create multiple continuous measures of greenness, acknowledging that greenness depends on numerous factors. So we produced three metrics as a lens for assessing the greenness of a job. And what this visual shows you is for these three occupations. So for example, energy advisors and assessors on the right, we can see how they perform across those three metrics, which immediately takes us away from a binary definition of a job as green or not. So you can see here that these occupations perform differently across different measures. And that kind of also pushes us beyond the idea of the most common green jobs or most typical green jobs that we're most used to hearing about. Liz mentioned solar panel installers, also solar engineers. But here we can talk about the greenness, for example, of business change managers, a less typical green occupation, but you can still see here an occupation that performs well against some of our green measures. So on the next slide, we can talk a bit about green skills. So our main finding here is that green skills are still quite a small part of most jobs. So in this visual that you can see, each dot represents an occupation. And on the x-axis, we can see the percentage of green skills asked for in a job advert for each of those occupations. So on the far right, we've got environmental consultants, which is the occupation with the highest percentage of green skills that we saw across all of the job adverts that we looked at. And you can see that's got a percentage of green skills of 22%. We can also look at another sort of typical green job, conservationist. You can see that's closer to 9%. But by far, the bulk of occupations are on the far left of this graph. And the average sits at just 1.5% for the green skills asked for on a job advert. So that really indicates that the green skills are still a very small proportion of the total skills required in most occupations, even those that are quite obviously green, like environmental consultants. They're still sitting at just a fifth of the total skills asked for being green. So on the next slide, we can delve a bit deeper into green skills, and using our approach, we look at the most common green skills that are asked for in job adverts that we analysed. So this graph shows the top 10 green skills that we see coming up in our data set. The most commonly requested being implementing environmental protection measures, followed by lean manufacturing, and managing habitats. On the next slide, we speak about cross-functional skills and the continued importance that these play, including in greener jobs. So if you think about the graph that we just looked at, where even the greenest job only has a fifth of skills that are green, that tells us that there'll be many more cross-functional transferable skills that play a really big role in green jobs. So here we can see things like advising customers, working in teams, coordinating activities with others are all skills that commonly co-occur with green skills in green occupations. And then finally, on the next slide, we have a graph that just shows a bit of the regional picture. So by measuring greenness in the way that we do with our 3 green measures, we see quite an interesting regional green job story, one that's driven more by large manufacturing and industrial towns than by major cities. So to illustrate that, we can look at the East Midlands, which is the third row down on this graph. So the East Midlands is a region that performs quite well on our 2 greenest measures related to skills and tasks. So those are the bars on the left and in the middle. So actually performing the highest on those 2 measures on average. But we can also see that it's an area with a high average industry greenhouse gas emissions rating. So probably an area with quite a high concentration of polluting industry, but on the flip side, also an area with a high concentration of green focused jobs, and actually outperforming other areas on time spent on green skills. So by contrast, we can look at London, which is the final row in this graph at the bottom. So London's job market, by comparison, has quite a low emissions intensity, but the green skills and task measures are among the lowest in the country. So even though the industries aren't very polluting, there's actually not a very high concentration of green skills or green tasks. And the reason for that might be that the industries that we see in large cities like London are focused on financial services and education, relatively less polluting industries, but not necessarily industries with high levels of green skills or tasks. So the final slide just says thanks for listening, but also points out to a few other resources that I just want to quickly highlight. So if you're interested in reading more about the data science approaches that we took that Liz briefly described on how we extracted information from job adverts related to the occupations, industries and skills, then you can follow these links. I think the slides will be shared after the webinar. And then also finally at the bottom, you'll see a link to the Green Jobs Explorer tool, which actually would be really great to share in the chat if that's possible. I'll just send it to my OECD colleagues to perhaps pass on. But this is a platform that we've built to make all the data that we've talked about today accessible. So you can explore all of the occupations that we have there. There's, I think, a little over 1,000 occupations, so you can select them and see how they perform against our green measures, look at salary information, look at the skills that are commonly asked for those roles. And you can also see lots of data viz similar to what we've shown in this presentation for you to explore, and those are interactive. So yeah, we'd love for you to take a look at those, and if you have any feedback or questions after doing that, then feel free to reach out to us. But yeah, that's our presentation. So thanks so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Liz and Zain, for this insightful presentation. I think it's another, gives additional information on the different angles that we want to look at in terms of green transition. We discuss about green skills, industries, impact on different places. So I think it links very well with the next presentation from my colleague Bessel, who is an economist at the OECD Trento Centre, and his work is related to the activities of the Spatial Productivity Lab. Wessel will present some of the new analysis that has been conducted on the role of skills and geography in the green transition. Please, Wessel, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Michaela. Thank you very much. And it's indeed great to follow up on what Jane and Liz have just presented, because what I'm going to try to present is very similar in process and in some of the messaging. So yeah, let's kick it off. So next slide, please. So of course, this is of course work together with Augustine, Jose, and Lucas. So we did this together. So first, a little bit of a motivational part. So the potential for local labor market challenge of the green transition is indeed quite great. So if you think about jobs that are vulnerable to the green transition, so those that perhaps are concentrated in sectors that are intensive in greenhouse gas emissions, they can be quite large, and they can be large across countries, and also within countries we see big differences. So this regional focus that you also saw in the previous presentation is really important to understand what it actually means for people that are living in places. So next slide, please. But there is also an opportunity, right? So what we also observe is already that the demand for workers is outpacing other in green jobs or specific green intensive jobs that are intensive in green tasks is outpacing those of other jobs. Right, so we see that for in Italy, it's about 25% more. In the UK, it's 20% more, and the US is also about 30% more. So this is hopeful, right? So we see this big challenge, but we also see an opportunity. So we see some demand, more demand for green jobs. Ideally, some of these people can switch, perhaps not directly to, immediately to the green class jobs, but to other jobs, while lots of people are taking up the new high demand green jobs. But we don't necessarily know very well how this can be done. And that's really what we're trying to contribute to in the same way that my colleagues from Nesta have been doing that. So the next slide. So the main challenge that we still try to answer and we try to contribute a little bit to is to really dig deeper into this role of geography. So why does geography matter for career changes in the green transition? So the main two aspects that we can think of is that transition is easier if there are more suitable jobs in the same local labor market that you might want to transition to. So that can be a challenge if these jobs that are currently vulnerable to the green transition are not located in the same locations where new green jobs are emerging. So maybe the windmills are not being installed in the same places where there were factory workers that are getting displaced. And you can think of other examples, of course. So that's one issue. That's an issue because people might not locate across regions, right? People tend to be quite sticky. And then the other dimension is that perhaps your local labor market is just not very large. And so the diversity of other jobs that are around you might not be as large, that allows you to switch to a job that is very similar or has a very similar skill amount relative to what you currently have. So if you have a thinner labor market, you might have to make a bigger jump to be able to find the next job that's out there for you. So that's the other reason why geography matters. So let's continue to the next slide. So what are we going to do here? So we take a very similar approach here. So we have these skills that come from job ads, from vacancies, and we think that these are informative for the requirements of jobs currently, and that they also are informative of the kind of skills that you currently have if you come out of a job that requires these skills currently. And then we look at the similarity of jobs based on the required skill set. So it's very simple. And then we'll apply these measures to jobs that are vulnerable to the green transition and jobs that and to other jobs to see what is this transition matrix, what does it look like. And then the way that we are getting to a regional interpretation of this, because all of the skills to jobs is we chose to do this at the national level. So then to get to a regional application of that is really looking at different compositions of the labor market in different regions, just because you can transition to another job, and that's great, but if that job does not exist in your region, then you have to go to the next best one. So the regional differences emerges because of different sets of jobs that are available in the region that you're located. And then once we have done that, we can zoom out a little bit more, or we can zoom out again and think a bit about what are these skills differences that is driving, say, the distance to the next job that you have, or the barrier that you might be facing. What are the skills that you're missing? All right, so that's basically the set out of what I'm going to try to show in these different steps. So the next slide, please. So first, on a very positive note, I think that's always useful because it tends to be a little bit of a cloudy discussion. But like, if you first look at what are these skills that people currently have in vulnerable jobs, so jobs that are concentrated in the high greenhouse gas sectors, they tend to have already lots of skills that are also requested in many other jobs. And we should not forget about that, right? So if we think about, here are some of this listed, we do this for 3 countries. That's like the start of our analysis. So we see this adapting to change, different kind of team management or teamwork. Like this is common across sectors. So we should not forget that lots of people that are in these vulnerable, say, jobs, they actually, many of the skills that they have, they can be applied across the board. So that's, let's start with that before we start identifying all the things that might be missing. All right, next slide, please. So even though there's commonality, there's also the challenge. And the challenge is that jobs that are intensive in green tasks require more skill than average. And we do this here in Italy, in the UK, and the US. We see these differences. So what it shows here is what is the average number of skills that are required for jobs that are in a region, and every region and jobs color is a region. So every dot is a region here. So on average, it's about 30% more skills are required in Italian regions for green jobs. But there is variation across regions as well, just because of the differences in the jobs that exist across regions in Italy. And brown jobs, the jobs that are vulnerable to the green transition, they tend to have a lower skill requirements relative to all the other jobs that are in the economy. So that difference is really there. And you might think, well, this might be because those jobs in the green economy, they tend to be higher skilled, perhaps for higher educated people, but we have already controlled for that in this graph. So we're only looking at people that require, say, only secondary education relative to other jobs that only require secondary education, and the same for jobs that need, say, tertiary and so on. So that we're really comparing more like with like, and then we still see for those people that require the same basic level of education, we still see higher skill required. So that's the challenge, and that's something that requires is missing. Next slide, please. So I don't have to take too much time for this slide because Liz already explained very well how this can be done. So you think about this overlap between the skills. So we're taking the skills data from our data sources. There's Lightcast, a private data supplier that is also the web scraping and the classification of skills by jobs. Then we weight the skills. So we try to weight skills that are more specific to a job relative to skills that are required across all jobs. Say, working with Microsoft, that's not necessarily a very critical skill because it's required everywhere, but something a bit more specific will have a higher weight, and then will be more important to understand what is the distance or the proximity to another job. And that just comes from having an overlap between the same skills that are being required between every 2 different types of jobs. So then we get a measure, and then once we have ranked every job to every other job, you can see what are the closest jobs that are available to any job, and then we can continue with our analysis. So the next slide, please. And that's interesting because then, for instance, here you have one example. So this is, say, if you would like to become a construction supervisor. So what kind of occupations are close to this construction supervisor? And then the colors are here indicating whether that's something that we consider to be intensive in green task, or that might be intensive in green task, but also in a polluting or a high greenhouse gas emission sector, or something that is very neutral. And we see that these jobs can be across these different types of industry. So you can really do this matching across different types of sectors, and that is also a bit similar to what you saw in the previous presentation. Is that you can be It can be in a green job or an intensive green task job, but it might come from say, a polluting or a high greenhouse gas emission sector. Right. So let's move on. So one thing that we wanted to do, so we have this beautiful measure, but it's still a bit theoretical because we don't necessarily know whether this overlap of skills that as we are calculating it, whether that's a good measure of actual transitions across jobs. So we wanted to test that. So we have, for the 3 different countries, we have data of actual job transition. We know for a person whether they transition to a job for any other reason, right? For any reason across over years. And we wanted to know whether that transition from one job to another job is actually correlated with the overlap in skills as the way we're calculating. And that works quite well, right? So what this analysis shows is that our measure of proximity across jobs based on the skills is a good predictor for actually observed job transition, independent on whether we're talking about green jobs or polluting jobs. So for us, it gives a bit of confidence that this skill measure or this proximity measure that comes out of it is a good and an informative predictor to work with once we want to go to some further analysis and policy advice. Next slide, please. One thing that I want to come back to. So we have this prediction of actual transition, but I also said before that location matters. And location matters because in say a bigger labor market, it might be easier to transition to a job that is more similar to you because it's actually available. And this is exactly what we find. So we have ranked here all the regions from the smallest to the biggest in terms of their labor force. And we see that this prediction works much better in larger labor markets. So the coefficient tends to be a bit bigger and it tends to be much more precise. Right, so it's really about this side of the labor market actually matters to understand whether your skill proximity that we're calculating is powerful, because you need to have the options available in your labor market to make that transition. Next slide, please. So what we find, so across regions, workers in vulnerable jobs are closer to other jobs than they are to green task jobs. Right, that's the main message. So if you are in a vulnerable job, where do you want to move to? You want to move to the closest job. These closest jobs tend to be much more likely to be in any other occupation that is not necessarily intensive in green task. Right? So it's not so much about whether we have to move or we have to facilitate or help people that are currently in vulnerable jobs to the green economy. Probably there is like a 2-step approach here. All those people that need to transition, we can help them transition to the jobs that they're most that are closest to what they know in terms of skill, but it doesn't necessarily need to be into a certain green job or a green industry. It can be to any other industry. But if you want to also fill the labor shortages that we see currently in jobs that are that are driven by the green transition, perhaps we have to look a little bit wider than only the people that are currently say vulnerable. And we see the same pattern, whether it's in Italy, the UK, and the US. There's not a lot of variation here across regions, right? In Italy, you see some variation, so there is some differences across regions on how easy it is to get to the next job. But in the UK and the US, actually, our analysis shows there's not a lot of difference. Could be a bit data-driven in terms of the source of the data that we're using, or the average size of the region that we're working with. Perhaps some of the Italian regions that tend to be rather small, so that exaggerate a little bit the differences that we see. Yeah, I think, we saw this bigger variation in terms of skills requirement. We're not seeing it here so much across countries for this proximity. What is much more important is this type of transition, whether from vulnerable to other or from other to green and from vulnerable to green. Next slide, please. So not a whole lot of regional differences, perhaps in this specific transition, but that also hides a lot of variation because here we're still aggregating across different sectors and different occupations. And there might be and then that averages things out a little bit. So if you're thinking about what actually happens in a specific region, there can be still a lot of variation. So here we look specifically about how many vacancies are there today for those vulnerable jobs. That doesn't mean that everyone has to change today or this year, but it gives us a bit of a sense of what is the share of vacancies available for those people that would want to change. So at the moment, no region currently has enough vacancies to cover all vulnerable workers in one go in all regions, which that's not necessarily problematic. It just means it's going to take a few years, which is all fine. But across UK regions, 1 in 5 vulnerable workers have a closed green task vacancy. So that's good, but that's 1 in 5 only. But that's okay. But what we also see is that some vulnerable occupations have multiple options available to them. You see that there is in the East Midlands, they have 8 vacancies for a specific job that they could move into. Right? So there is this huge variation. So something that colleagues from Nesta already showed, that in some of these regions there is much more demand and there might be much more potential for this transition. That's exactly what we're finding as well. Next slide, please. So this is probably the most complicated chart of my presentation. It's also the last one, so hang on. So what we did was to also look again at this. What are the skills that are required? So and that currently people that are in a vulnerable job currently don't have. So what kind of skills should they acquire to be able to transition to, say, an green intensive job or any other job? And then we classified these different skills into bigger groups, otherwise it got a bit complicated. So we have leadership and management, sales and marketing, soft skills, technical skills, and communication skills as well. So what we see across the 3 countries is that if you're looking at the top 10 skills that you would need to acquire that are most commonly missing, some can be in leadership, some can be in sales and marketing, but among those top 10, perhaps half of them, or across most countries and the regions, half of them are in the soft skills. So this is, the presentation, the teamwork, and so on. And then for specifically the UK and the US, we also see this high demand for technical skills. So these can be much more specific, much more regional specific, and much more industry specific. So here it's all bunched together, but in terms of, what is then the implication, you would really have to go again deeper to understand what is actually requested in specific regions. So yeah, that's probably where the focus should be in terms of, a training provision or working with industries to understand which technical skills should be addressed or should be provided or training should be provided for to make the next move. Next slide, please. So just wanted to summarize. So what are the main points of what we're finding here? So the green transition requires career changes because some jobs are vulnerable and certain industries risk declining over the next, say, 5 to 10 years. And some of the sectors critical to the green transition are currently already facing above average labor shortages. So career transitions are required. And the skills across jobs is a useful concept to analyze possible job transition for occupations across regions, and we showed it. So the barrier to job transition relates to these job characteristics. Job intensive and green tasks require on average more skills than other jobs, especially jobs vulnerable to the green transition and to local labor markets. So smaller labor and less diverse labor markets provide fewer options for workers. And across most regions, what we're finding is that soft and technical skills are most frequently cited as missing from vulnerable jobs to successfully transition to other jobs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wessel, for this interesting presentation, which introduced another concept for our discussion that will take place during the Q&A session, which is soft skills and also other technical skills that may be relevant in the green transition. This topic, I think, links again very well with the next presentation from Skill Lab. Skill Lab in recent years has developed different tools to identify people's skills that better connect them to both training, education, and employment. And I would like to leave the floor to Simon, who is going to present their work on skills-based labor matching tools. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michaela. I really appreciate it. And thanks, everybody, for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon. My name is Simon Schmidt. I'm a partner at Skill Lab. I'm also currently acting as the director of the Just Skills Hub. I will get into what both of these things are in a little bit. Next slide, please. So SkillUp, we're a social business, we're an impact business located in Amsterdam, but we work with governments and organizations around the world. In general, we're a software company that provides tools for labor market information systems, career guidance, and everything that has to do with connecting people with jobs and education by focusing on their underlying potential or their skills. So we use artificial intelligence to create accessible profiles of people's skills, the skills that are required by employers, and the skills that are conveyed by education providers. Next slide, please. We're also currently the founding technical partner and current operational lead of the Just Skills Hub. The Just Skills Hub was convened by the UN High-Level Champions for Global Climate Action at COP26. And what we're trying to do with the hub is to establishing a multi-stakeholder ecosystem to make the transition to a green economy or the workforce transition necessary for a green economy and a just transition a reality. Next slide, please. So at SkillUp, we do many different things, and I could talk about all of them, but we'll focus on a couple of different things in particular today, which is really the theme of labor market transitions and the theme of profiling of skills or skill surveys to inform the data background and to inform those labor market transitions and the skill requirements specifically and the skill demand specifically. Next slide, please. So how is the green transition transforming skill demands and specifically transforming local skills demand? Next slide. Determining skills demand really is a tough thing to do, and you've heard about some different methodologies, mostly related to job postings, online job vacancy, database analysis. All of these different methods have different advantages and disadvantages. But one special thing about the transition to a green economy is that it's not so much driven by technological advancement, but it's very much driven by policy, right? And there are certain models, input-output models, et cetera, that help you to determine the impact of policies on employment to a certain degree. So there are different aspects where determining skills demand through occupation outlook, so forecasting employment change by occupation based on certain policies, can be as meaningful as determining the skills demand by looking at online job vacancy databases or looking at the demand analysis that's based on expert opinion. One thing that's really important, next slide, please, is that no single methodology is enough to really capture the entirety of the quote unquote truth of the skill demand and the change in skill demand due to the transition to a green economy. So there's using different methods and interlinking these methods is really crucial and really central. And what we believe is incredibly helpful in doing that, next slide, please, is the presence or the development of what we call a living taxonomy. So a skills taxonomy that doesn't have the key drawbacks that you sometimes see in skills taxonomies where they are statically tied to occupations. There's a time lag in adjusting them. And there's a disconnect between determining what the outlook for an occupation looks like and how that outlook for an occupation is translated into the outlook for certain skills. So that's some work that we've been doing a lot recently, and I'll talk a little bit in practice about what that looks like and broadly about this theme of using skills surveys and using real-life labor market user-verified data to inform taxonomies and to update taxonomies to make these different methodologies interoperable and have a more complete picture of what the demand for certain skills beyond occupations looks like. Next slide, please. So what are skill surveys and what are the skills needed in green occupations? And I'll put green in quotes here because we don't really think about green occupations. We think about the workforce necessary to drive the transition to a green economy. And those occupations do not necessarily have to be green by definition, because if you're a linesman, a woman, or a cable jointer, and you're building the grid, whether your job is green or not depends entirely on what you're building the grid for, whether the energy flowing through that grid is renewable or not, right? So in our mind, there's no such thing as a green occupation, but there is a workforce demand related to the transition to a green economy, and that piece is important to us. Next slide, please. So our approach relies on generating user-verified skill data for people, so for the skills that people use in their day-to-day as employees or as job seekers, employers, so the skills that employers are looking for, and education providers. To that end, we use AI to organize skill and occupation taxonomies. What you see in the background here is ESCO, but we also work in ONET and different taxonomies. We organize these taxonomies to make these 14,000 skills understandable and accessible to people through a skill-based interview. And through that interview, people create data that is up to date, that is real world, that is lived experience, and we use that data to update and localize skill and occupation taxonomy. So you're not just looking at ESCO, which is meant to capture the entire European labor market, but you're looking at, after a while of using it, you're looking at a localized version that really captures that specific labor market of that country or region. Next slide, please. We talk about connected labor markets a lot and connecting all of these different intermediaries, because ultimately it is an interplay between the skills that employers want, and skills that employers want aren't necessarily the skills that employers actually need, or the skills that people working in those occupations have, which we found through implementing numerous projects. So we're connecting all of these different stakeholders, because that interaction, only in that interaction can you really prepare labor markets for the transition. Next slide, please. What we're doing, what collecting data at the source, or user-verified data, means for us is that we surveyed workers or employees on the skills that they use in their day-to-day work. So, for example, I'll talk a little bit about a project that we're running in Egypt, but we're serving workers that work in renewable energy there on what do you do in your work as a solar engineer every day, and what are the skills that are actually required to work as a solar engineer in the Suez Canal zone, for example. So that skill data is collected on the individual level. That skill data is specific for that individual, but if you aggregate those up, you get a really good idea of what the skill requirements for that specific occupation in that specific locality are. So you really gain structured insights into the skill requirements of particular occupations from a worker, from an employee perspective. Next slide, please. We do the same thing for employers, right? Because the employee perspective, it might be very of the moment, but we also want to be a little bit forward-looking and what are employers actually looking for. So we connect the skill expectation of employers to the occupations that they're hiring for. And one really interesting thing is that you really see a bit of a difference in between what employers ask for and what the skills that employees actually have in performing those jobs. So that's not necessarily a one-to-one. We also do the same thing with subject matter experts. Next slide, please. So we collect that same data on what, this is especially important for occupations that are currently emerging, where there maybe aren't any people working in those occupations to interview yet. So sort of what are the expectations on skills from a standardized taxonomy that you expect to be a part of that specific occupation. Next slide, please. So what we can do with that data is we can aggregate and disaggregate it however we want. So you understand really the skill requirements of different occupations, and you're not just, and you can sort of change the taxonomy that you're using so that you're not relying on text mining or semantic search and match for online job vacancies, that you're not relying on a taxonomy that may not be locally relevant for you, but you're relying on a taxonomy that captures as to the highest possible degree the reality of your labor market and the actual needs that are connecting skills to, or the actual skill needs that are connected to the occupations that you see a shift in supply or demand for. Next slide, please. So this is the project that I mentioned before in Egypt with the EBRD and the Egyptian Ministry of International Cooperation. So we're talking based on research that we've done, so input-output models, etc., on which occupations are most growing in demand. We're basically doing work that's quite similar to a sectoral skills council and engaging with employers and figuring out what the skill needs for those specific occupations are in the green and renewable energy sector. So to that end, we're providing them with the skill survey tools. We're optimizing the distribution of that tool, and we're doing all of the data analysis on the back end to really figure out, okay, you're looking for these are the 50 occupations that you're looking at in great detail. What are the skills that you actually need across those occupations, and what's the skill overlap between them? So you're not necessarily optimizing for your curriculum or your industrial policy for one specific occupation, but for that subset of skills that are in common across all of these different occupations. And we think that's a really good way to sort of de-risk workforce development in a certain way, because you might think that you're becoming the hydrogen valley of the future, but how many hydrogen valleys can there really be? So the best laid plans may not necessarily come to fruition, but if you're focusing on the skills that are in common in a lot of the different occupations that you're projecting to grow in demand due to the transition to a green economy, you sort of get to have your cake and eat it too, and that you're de-risking your workforce development, but you're also preparing for a broad range of options for your future. And if you're looking a little bit further ahead than sort of a 2, 3, 5 year planning horizon, we think that's really important. I think that also brings me to the end. Next slide, please. I think that's the last slide. Yeah, that's the last slide. So that brings me to the end. And so as a concluding thought, we think the value of taxonomies is using taxonomies and leveraging that use of taxonomies in order to make those taxonomies better and produce more accurate picture of what the labor market in that country, region, or locality looks like. So by producing these different tools, whether it's skill survey or for career guidance for unemployed folks, or whether it's for sectoral skills councils, whatever it might be, we think leveraging the use of those technologies to improve those technologies and automatically update them has really great value in capturing as accurate as possible labor market information. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon, for this concluding presentation of the webinar. I think we can move to the Q&A session. I already have some questions for all the panelists. And I think probably we can start with Simon, Zain, and Liz. Simon already provided an example of the work that Skill Lab conducted in Egypt, and I would like to ask these three presenters, how do you think your work, which can sound a bit technical for non-expert audience, how this can be used by local government, by employers, by other local policymakers? It would be, I think, very interesting for our audience to understand that, and maybe then they will get in touch with you and ask more specific questions. Thank you. Maybe Simon, as you just ended, you can start.
Yeah.
And then,
so
yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So the data collection, everything we do is based on the individual level, right? So if even within a region, and as an example, taking the province of Mpumalanga in South Africa, for example, with a big coal mining region, we can individually distribute access to the application for vulnerable workers or for people who are likely to be laid off due to the transition, and then map that data create that data at the local level, use that data at the local level, and have a really regional, zoomed-in view of what that labor market looks like. So because you can aggregate and disaggregate data however you want, because it's collected at the individual level, we think it gives really great insight into local transitions, as well as sort of these more big picture transitions if you want to look at countries as a whole. But I think as especially the presentations by Zain and Liz, but also by Vessel especially, have pointed out, the transitions are inextricably local, right? Like people don't lose their job and move to the other end of the country to find a new job. That doesn't really happen. So that local view is essential. That's going to be the transition is local. The jobs are destroyed locally, jobs are emerging locally, and yeah, there's really no way past zooming in and really doing this analysis on the local level.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think you also introduced another topic, which is the one about inclusion and people, more vulnerable people and those who are far from the labor market. I think I will give the floor to Nesta to answer the same question on how their tool could be used by local governments or by employers.
Yeah, I can say a few things and pass over to Zain. For us, I think in terms of policymakers, we were thinking in terms of the fact that we have these multi-dimensional angles to greenness, and how perhaps if there are targets towards greening certain industries, you could then do a deep dive into what are the skills being asked for? Are they particularly green? Are the job titles being asked for particularly green as well? So it could help policymakers understand that we're moving in the right direction, for example, especially in those highly polluting like manufacturing and construction type of industries. Another area, going back to the regional side of things, definitely we would like our tool to be used by kind of policymakers in terms of tailoring education and training for specific localities rather than just nationally. And another kind of area that we've been looking at is kind of in terms of careers advice. So we know lots of people want to, especially young people, want to work in green jobs. And it's just about broadening people's knowledge of what green jobs actually are, and hopefully providing some examples. Zane, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I can maybe just mention maybe worth saying that the tool that we've built, the Green Jobs Explorer, has only been live for a bit less than 2 months. So we're still kind of finding those sort of case studies and use cases of where people have picked it up and made really good use of it. But just some early kind of signals, I guess, that might suggest where the tool is proving useful. So as Liz mentioned, careers advice seems to be an area that is kind of lacking detailed information at the skills level. They have a sense of what the green occupations are that they can, show to young people or career changes, but are finding it difficult to give more detailed advice, especially tailored to a specific region. So we think the tool has potential there, and we've been sort of in early talks about collaboration with an organization that provides careers advice to young people and linking that to psychometric information, so that you can make basically a quiz for a young person to fill out that recommends green occupations. And then also we just had a message recently from DEFRA, which is the UK's Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And obviously they have a set of occupations that they're quite interested in from a kind of jobs labour strategy perspective. And we're quite interested to look at their kind of key occupations from the perspective of these multiple green measures, to see how they stack up, and also to make comparisons with other occupations. So those are some of the early sort of use cases that are appearing, and we're hoping to see more kind of practical use cases over the next few months. But yeah.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting and promising if it's an early stage of the research. I would like to ask Bessel if he wants to add also on this point about policy making, thinking from the OECD perspective, what local governments could do with these exercises, and what examples maybe we have come across in our research.
Yeah, thanks. So one thing that came to my mind on a very practical example is we finished a project on the local labor market of Amsterdam last year. And there they had this initiative for the metropolitan region overall, where this house of skills was really some kind of a lab where they were doing this already. They were trying to for all the job seekers that are there, people that were looking for a job, might want to have transition, to identify what skills that they currently possess, and then see to what extent that they are fitting for those sectors and occupations that saw high vacancies. So it's more of a general question, right? So this whole skills analysis is not limited only to the so the green transition can be applied to any kind of job category. So that makes it so nice because it's so flexible. So there they were really focusing on the people that perhaps have a little bit of a difficulty finding a job because they might not have the formal qualifications to enter jobs for employers that would ask for it, but then having the skills information from their work experience or from other life experiences would help them to get into a job. But they were also specifically looking at those jobs that are in high demand, and one of these was everything that has to do with the green transition. So installation, construction sector, for instance. And then once they had this kind of match, they could work with industries and with sectors to develop training courses that are specific for those people that have to transition into a new occupation from somewhere else. So that was a very interesting, very frontier, very advanced way of doing that. So that is nice, right? So even though people might not want to take my data for granted, the same way that Simon already showed, right? You can do this basically in every location. You can try to get this kind of data about what skills that people currently possess and what might be in demand, and do that exercise for that region or that sector that you're most interested in. That's a nice flexible way. And I think, of course, there are different methodologies that you can do this through the job ads, through the surveys, through some kind of a gamification of building a CV. And that's all fine, right? It's just about trying to get away from this from the structure of I have a job in this sector, so I have to find another job in that sector, or I studied for this kind of job, so that's what I have to do for the rest of my life. That does not give us enough flexibility to help the transitions that are required in a new economy. But yeah, you talked also about inclusion and having a bit of an eye for the social context on that. Of course, transition is also a scary thing for lots of people. So I don't think we should forget about that. Change comes with uncertainty. It comes with doubt whether you're fit for that. So I think we should definitely take that into account. But I think that's really the role for policy and also for employer organizations to step in. And like this is, if you're interested in working in our sector or in this occupation, it doesn't matter that you don't know everything yet. This is our kind of training trajectory that we have in place, and we have some guaranteed job for you in the future. I think that should help, right? That should help this transition of that might be scary for some people. I think that's nice, but this skills analysis, everything that we're talking about here, that really helps to make things a bit more flexible. Maybe that's easy for us to say, given that we tend to be a bit more on the high skill end, but I think I think it's possible for everyone in the end.
Thank you, Wessel. It's nice to hear some encouraging messages from your feedback. Simon has his hand raised, so please comment on what Wessel said. But also there is a question I think you are the best place to answer, is about how to encourage training in green occupation and skills for young people to help them go to green jobs and not some brown companies. And we are asked to look at emerging labor markets. So maybe this is a question for you.
Yeah, the first I wanted to say something that Wessel has picked up on, I wanted to pick up on something that Wessel has mentioned, which is, in theory, this is not a different transition than any other, it's not different than any other sort of mass labor market transition, whether it's a factory that's the only employer in town closing for whatever reason, or a factory opening that all of a sudden needs a bunch of new workers. So it's a mass layoff event and a mass hiring event sort of at the same time. But it is structural and it is policy driven, which makes it a little bit different, right? So there's a certain predictability to it, and this is something that we've picked up on in the Just Transition projects, is that the most important thing is to start early, because it takes time to develop training courses. It takes time to find the trainers to conduct those training courses. And if you're talking about upskilling and reskilling, time is the most valuable resource you have before that. And I think that's really important to note. On encouraging young people, I think it's sort of incumbent on that piece of career guidance, career advice, to to make clear to young people what the job prospects of certain jobs are, right? Like that if you're looking into sort of a vocational career that doing something around heat pump installation, you'll be busy for years you'll be busy for years installing heat pumps, and you'll have a safe, secure job if that's what you have. So really communicating that, and also obviously financial incentives matter there as well as sort of social status of certain jobs, right? Like I think a lot of the sort of low mid-skill jobs that we're talking about aren't necessarily seen as high status as some of the other jobs, but they're probably more required. So there's a certain sort of social cultural element there as well. There was an aspect of emerging markets. I think that the experience that we've had is that the structure of this problem doesn't differ significantly whether you're talking about a more advanced or less advanced society. So sort of the data infrastructure might be better in some countries, but even the most advanced countries don't have this quite figured out if you're looking at labor shortages, etc. So there is a bit of I don't think there's a significant difference in between emerging and more advanced economies. There's a difference in sort of labor composition, whether you're facing skill shortages or whether you have a lot of young people that you need to get into the labor market. But that has more to do with the demographics of countries rather than maybe the economic situation.
Thank you, Simon. We have a couple of minutes left, and I would like to ask Lucas there is a question in the chat, and I think, Lucas, you can give the OECD perspective. This is about what to do when organizations, employers identify green skills, and how organizations can prepare to train their workforce to improve their green skills, and how to make sure that skills don't become obsolete, which is related to the work that has already been conducted by OECD. And I think what is important today is also to give a forward looking of our work. And so it would be great if you could share what the projects are in our team and which types of activities we are going to conduct in the near future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Michaela. And it's nice that this question came up because it really nicely connects with what was discussed. Really very much around the importance of labor market intelligence, right? So we can't address what we don't understand or what we are not aware of. And so I think oftentimes it is a question of lacking information, of not being aware of opportunities and not understanding the direction of travel. So for instance, for employers, in terms of the skills that might be required for workers or young people to choose the type of education and training that might, provide them the right trajectory and so on. So it's our work, also the current and planned work is very much focused on this pillar, on providing better labor market intelligence on the one hand, a lot of granularity on different types of firms, for different types of sectors, for different types of communities, and different types of workers, because the individual challenges are so vastly different, as well as then the second component, really translating it to policy, which is oftentimes perhaps the more, let's say it's an equally difficult task. And I just want to say, before reiterating what, explaining a little bit more our ongoing work, is that just based on the discussion, something that came through, and I think we just need to re-emphasize this. What we discussed today is matching mechanisms, leveraging the power of technology, of artificial intelligence, of machine learning, and so on. Using big data is really provides a tool that is flexible. It can be used for all types of transformation processes, and it's not, and therefore it's really flexible and perhaps a powerful tool. Now, for us, the green transition indeed remains an important area of our work. We recently, last 2 weeks, published the OECD Trento Transition Tracker, which is a publicly available data dashboard, data which essentially assesses regions' preparedness for labor market skills challenges of the green and digital transition. And 2 weeks ago, we also had our large online conference, Local Skills Week, the OECD Local Skills Week, which ran completely under the topic of preparing local workforces for the transition. But more concretely, I'd say in line with our discussion today, an important part of our work, planned and ongoing, is really on analytical insights, labor market intelligence, and policy recommendations, for instance, in terms of career guidance, evaluation of training programs, all of which are then supposed to be tailored to support job transitions out of vulnerable declining sectors, occupations, and so on. And very much in line with what our colleague Nesta said as well, I think we are working on getting a better understanding of the specific skills needed in specific sectors, be it, whether we label them green or not, but they might play a crucial part along the way to do the net zero transition, as well as understanding how jobs change within the sector in terms of the tasks they require, the job contents, and so on. And sorry, I just like to use this opportunity to also point out that the work that Vessel presented today will then be published in a larger piece of work, our flagship report, Job Creation in Local Economic Development 2024 in November this year. So we'll happily provide the link, and I'd say stay tuned, but I'm sure we'll have plenty of more work, and certainly we have all of these discussions today have given us a lot of food for thought, and further points to discuss in other formats as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much to all panelists today, and for participants who asked questions through the Q&A tab. I think it was a very interesting workshop. If you would like to listen again to the recording, it will be uploaded in the webinar webpage. Here in the chat, there are some links to our recent work, and I hope you will find that as interesting as me. And we will see. I hope to see you all to the next webinar organized by the Spatial Productivity Lab. Thank you very much, and have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.